taking control of Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Canada were not part of Trump's election campaign, which focused on borders, oil, and tax. When did this shift happen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't remember any of this coming up in the election campaign, even though it was a very long couple of months. This isn't entirely new for Trump. So he talked about Greenland in his first administration. Some listeners might remember, but he spoke about it then as more of a kind of real estate deal or proposition. The way he's speaking about it now is quite new. He's even gone so far when he was asked a question in a press conference to not rule out using force to annex Greenland and potentially Panama for the United States. So it is quite a shift from the election campaign, but in a way, it's, I think, not really a surprising one for a number of reasons. The United States, of course, has a really long history of being an empire or being empire-like. There are long and sometimes kind of ridiculous scholarly debates about when the United States became an empire, whether it still is. Trump, as he usually does, is kind of highlighting that history and pointing out how easy it is for Americans to forget that history, even though they're kind of in the middle of quickly reviving it. I think potentially, as much as what Trump is doing fits into that longer history of imperialism and particularly white imperialism, he's also doing what Trump does best, which is obscuring other things, drawing everybody's attention to something outrageous that he's doing or saying in order to avoid scrutiny on other things. And I think in this case, it's particularly that all of his kind of flagship promises, Alice, you mentioned borders, you mentioned oil drilling, you mentioned tax reform, are things that are actually really difficult to do. And they're really difficult to do with a Congress that has razor-thin margins and certain members of Trump's own party, the Republican Party, that are pretty prone to acting out and demanding things even of Trump. And so I think that this is his way of kind of projecting power and masculinity and empire while obscuring the kind of more complicated business of actually getting what he wants to get done in an effective way. And so far, it seems to be working.
Mm. And for listeners interested in America's history of imperialism, the Empire series with William Dalrymple and Anita Anand has a few really good episodes on that. So what you're saying here, this sounds as though you're really talking about an undermining of Trump's anti-war isolationist identity. Is that right?
Yeah, big time. I think, we've spoken, Alice, about this idea of Trump being an isolationist and being anti-war before on the podcast because, he's been so effective at kind of deploying this line that he is anti-war, that his administration was the first since Jimmy Carter's to have not actually started a war, which, like pretty much everything Trump says is, if not a lie, a distortion, I suppose, of the truth. But this kind of highlights, I think, this idea of not ruling out force to conquer a sovereign nation, a couple of sovereign nations for the United States, kind of highlights that, Trump isn't anti-war. He's just anti kind of specific types of war. In fact, his vision for the United States in the world is quite a violent and conquering one. He has this really aggressive vision of American power, and none of that is really isolationist. I think people kind of tend to see him quite understandably as isolationist because, he threatens to withdraw from organizations like NATO, from multilateral organizations like even, the World Health Organization. And that, of course, is a form of isolationism, but it doesn't mean that the United States will withdraw from the world under Trump. It just means that we'll stomp all over it in kind of a different way. It's surprising to me that it's happening so quickly, that he's highlighting that so quickly, before he's even inaugurated. But, he does like to surprise us like that.
Mm. And when you talk about changes to his stated aims before he's even been inaugurated, one of them is the changing commentary that he's had on Ukraine, for example, that he had said, on day one we'll end the war, and now it looks as though it's going to be 100 days. So do you think in terms of the election promises we're going to see a lot more of this winding back?
Yeah, look, I think so. I think that was always going to happen on Ukraine, because any effort to end that war on day one would require effectively just unacceptable concessions on the part of the Ukrainians and Europeans more broadly to Russia. You know, that was just never going to fly in Europe in particular. And I think Trump and people around him were aware of that. That was just an effective line that they were deploying. So I think we will see that happen on multiple fronts, where the realities of governing clash with the, you know, radical kind of outrageous promises that Trump has made. So I think we will see that kind of pantomime and his reflexive need for kind of symbolic victories, you know, the need to talk about conquering Greenland as opposed to the kind of difficult business of enacting immigration reform, as horrifying as his ideas for that are. But that doesn't mean we won't see really quick, really aggressive efforts to implement that agenda. Nonetheless, he'll have a suite of executive, or he does have a suite of executive orders waiting for him to sign kind of as soon as he's inaugurated, as soon as he walks into the White House, many of which will be about immigration or about oil drilling, for example. And there are plans already underway in Congress to create what they would describe as an omnibus bill, so a kind of enormous bill that covers all of Trump's agenda around immigration and oil and tax reform in particular, and kind of ramming that through Congress as quickly as possible. You know, there is this sense, I think, and again, we've talked about this before, about learning the lessons of the first Trump administration and not kind of falling into the chaos of the first couple of days of the first go round with things like the Muslim ban. I think there's a strong chance that that will happen again, but Trump and the people around him are very conscious of how badly that went for them, and I think are creating strategies to avoid a direct repeat of that scenario.